Steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. Steal away home. I ain't got long to stay here.
If anyone had any lingering doubts about the role of slavery in causing the Southern states to secede from the Union in 1861, Vice President Alexander Stephens' speech, explaining the difference between the constitutions of the U.S. and the Confederate States of America, should have abolished those doubts. As he said, the cornerstone of the new government was the assertion that slavery was the natural condition of African Americans. In doing so, they called the Founding Fathers fundamentally wrong. But of course, in 1861, no one had any doubt as to the reason why Southern states left the Union. Forces on both sides of the issue had been gathering for decades. In just over half a century, the tiny abolitionist societies, begun by Quakers in New England, had grown into formidable organizations. Their leaders insisted that slavery was not simply a social evil, but an issue of personal morality. That each individual slaveholder was personally, morally culpable. Slave narratives in novels such as Uncle Tom's Cabin raised awareness and anger among the public, particularly in the North. Southern planters were affronted by this approach. Believing themselves to be morally upright, they rejected accusations that they were sinful simply for owning slaves. Southern leaders changed from apologizing for slavery as a necessary evil to proclaiming it as a positive good. They insisted that persons living in Africa were in much worse living conditions than the descendants of those who had been brought over as slaves. As humanity does so often, they did not look to morality and then determine the proper way to live, but instead looked at how they were living and determined that to be the proper morality. The dividing line between North and South grew even sharper, and it was drawn on the issue of slavery. As the U.S. gained more and more territory, expanding westward according to its manifest destiny, disagreements became arguments. Arguments became fights. Fights became battles, and eventually, battles became war, as America dragged itself up from slavery. The invention of the cotton gin and the resultant growth of the cotton industry meant an explosion in the slave population. In Georgia, the number of slaves in the population rose from less than 30,000 in 1790 to over 460,000 in 1860. Looking at the major slave-holding states of 1790, Virginia, South Carolina, Maryland, North Carolina, Georgia, and Delaware, their combined slave population grew 177% between 1790 and 1860, from about 640,000 to almost 1.8 million. But for slave power to really grow, it would have to expand beyond the states where it had always been legal. It would need to expand westward, into the territories acquired by the Louisiana Purchase and the Mexican-American War. By 1860, the major slave states created from these territories, Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas, would have over 2.1 million slaves. Small wonder, then, that the abolitionists fought so hard to keep slavery out of those territories, and Southern planters fought so hard to expand slavery into them. The U.S. Congress, while still operating under the Articles of Confederation, made its first attempt to limit the spread of slavery into new territories in 1787. The Northwest Ordinance established the process whereby territories would be governed by the U.S. and could eventually become states. The U.S. had acquired a vast western territory from Britain as part of the Treaty of Paris. The Northwest Ordinance described that part of the territory northwest of the Ohio River and declared that slavery would be prohibited in those lands. The prohibition on slavery did not apply to the territory south of the Ohio, continuing America's sectarian divide in labor, ideology, and economy. However, those lands were currently claimed by Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia, and were thus already slave states. Eventually, those states would relinquish their claims, and the southern lands would be carved into the states of Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi. When the Louisiana Purchase more than doubled the territory of the U.S., a New Deal became necessary. The Northwest Ordinance did not address these new lands, and therefore there was no limitation on slavery there. The Missouri Compromise in 1820 set new boundaries following the principles of the Northwest Ordinance. The deal came about because the people of the area that would become Missouri wished to join the Union as a slave state. This would have given slave states an advantage of one state in the Senate, and therefore many Northerners were opposed. The compromise that resulted allowed the admission of Missouri as a slave state simultaneously with the admission of Maine as a free state. The compromise also prohibited slavery in the remaining territory north of Missouri's southern border, except within Missouri itself. Thomas Jefferson was greatly disturbed by the Missouri Compromise.
I had for a long time ceased to read the newspapers or pay any attention to public affairs, confident they were in good hands, and content to be a passenger in our bark to the shore from which I am not distant. But this momentous question, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once as the keel of the Union. It is hushed indeed for the moment, but this is a reprieve only, not a final sentence. I regret that I am now to die in the belief that this useless sacrifice of themselves by the generation of 76 to acquire self-government and happiness to their country is to be thrown away by the unwise and unworthy passions of their sons, and that my only consolation is to be that I live not to weep over it.
Jefferson feared that clearly establishing a portion of the country as free and a portion slave would inevitably lead to the Union being ripped apart. He favored a gradual process of emancipation and expatriation, whereby freed slaves could be colonized elsewhere. Many free blacks and former slaves opposed this idea, demanding that this was their country as much as it was those who had descended from Europeans. Regardless, Jefferson's predicted crisis of disunion was fast approaching, and the issue of dividing territories would become one of the greatest flashpoints. In 1837, the policy of the Missouri Compromise continued, with Arkansas being admitted to the Union as a slave state, while Michigan was admitted as a free state. In 1850, difficulties broke out again. The slave state of Texas, which had been annexed in 1845, claimed land north of the Compromise's dividing line. This land had been ceded by Mexico in the Mexican-American War. Other issues also had the two sides talking secession. Anti-slavery activists were angered that the District of Columbia allowed slavery and contained the largest slave market in North America. At the same time, California had recently petitioned to join the Union as a free state, though its borders would cross below the Missouri Compromise line. These issues were wrapped up in the Compromise of 1850, which broke off part of Texas to form the New Mexico Territory, reimbursed Texas $10 million to pay off their war debt, abolished the trade, but not the practice of slavery in D.C., admitted California as a free state, and passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Everyone found something to hate about the compromise, but it succeeded in staving off a civil war for another 10 years. But it could not hold off bloodshed entirely. It was only 4 years before another conflict over territories led to open battle, guerrilla combat, and massacres and atrocities by both sides.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.